What's up everyone, my name is Omar and in this video I will be demonstrating how to configure and manage an end-to-end deployment with Azure Bicep. Welcome back everyone and thanks for joining. In this episode I will be discussing how to manage an end-to-end deployment using Azure Bicep. But first, if you haven't done it yet, please subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss anything when I upload new content. If you remember in my last video for Bicep 101, I demonstrated how to create Bicep template files, create modules, how to do loops in Bicep, and configuring an environment configuration set. This time, I would like to show you how to configure your pipeline in Azure DevOps using what we learned in our last video and extend it to deploy an entire solution. When you use pipelines, you can automate the validation, testing, and deployment of your Bicep code. Many of the benefits of using Bicep come from deploying your Azure infrastructure alongside the other components of your solution, such as applications and database configuration. Our main goal in this video will be deploying and provisioning Azure resources by using an Azure Bicep file, deploying an application to an Azure App Service, publish a database schema to an Azure SQL database, add a sample data to an Azure SQL database, and an Azure Storage blob container. I will also show you how to effectively use pipeline artifacts, Bicep outputs, and pipeline variables to coordinate the different parts of your pipeline. And if you want to follow along with this tutorial, I would recommend the Microsoft.com/learn tutorial, which I will include as a reference in the description in this video. And with that said, let's get started. First, let me drive your attention to this diagram so you can understand what we are trying to accomplish here. And by the way, this diagram comes directly from Microsoft.com/learn. On the tutorial I mentioned, and I have to give kudos to Microsoft for the documentation in the Microsoft.com/learn website, which I encourage you to use it more often. So, in some organizations, they might have a team dedicated to control plane deployments, meaning more dedicated to the infrastructure, and another team that manages the data plane activities. In these situations, it's often tempting to create multiple pipelines, each owned by the team that's responsible for its particular area. For example, you might create one pipeline to deploy the Bicep code that deploys your infrastructure, meaning the control plane, and another pipeline that deploys the website application code, which will be your data plane. Although this approach might give you some flexibility in how you manage the pipelines, and you can configure it the way you want, that's totally fine, but it can be challenging to keep everything in sync. Instead, it's often better to create a single pipeline that deploys everything required for your solution, even if the components are managed by different people or different teams. So here are some important components you would like to have for your deployment. In the build stage, you will have the build for your application project and your database project, which is our case. And for the infrastructure, you will likely have a lint step so it can lint your Bicep file. This will help you to validate and make sure your Bicep file is configured correctly. When those steps succeeded, you want to run a validation to make sure all your parameters are configured correctly on your Bicep file. Basically running a what if so you can see what would be deployed. And if that succeeds, then go ahead and deploy your infrastructure in your first environment. Then deploy the website, and when it gets done, run a smoke test to make sure the deployment is what you were expecting. And then continue with the next environment, which for best practice, you should have some sort of gate approval when it comes to production, and so on. You get the idea here. Let's switch to our repo, and before getting into the pipeline stages and configurations, let's take a look at the Bicep file. And for the purpose of this demo, I'm not using any modules, I'm just using a single Bicep file to deploy all my resources. At the top, I have a few parameters. Here I'm using the environment type, using two allow environments, like test and production. I also have variables to generate a specific naming convention I want my resources to have. And I also have created an environment configuration set. And then I have my resources like application insights, app service plan, app service, database, etc. Finally, I have a couple of outputs for the resources, and I will show you how to call those from pipeline to set them as variables. If you're not familiar on how to create the resources in Bicep, I would advise you to check out the Bicep 101 tutorial video I recorded before, which I will also link in the description of this video. I also have a bicep config.json file as a bicep linter. So basically, when the az-bicep build command runs to convert the bicep file into an ARM template, it will use this bicep config.json file to validate the configurations I set and to make sure it builds correctly. This file checks the bicep files for syntax error and best practice violations. In other words, it helps to enforce coding standards by providing guidance during deployment. Let's take a look at the Azure pipeline.yaml file to check the stages. In the build stage, we have the linting process and also the build, which is pointing to a file inside a pipeline templates folder. So let's take a look at that one first. Here, we have kind of the same steps for both the application and database project. First, it's building the website, copying the files, and then publish as an artifact for later use in a folder called website. And then to create the DAG pack, run a build, copy the files, and publish it in a folder called database. We will see it in action when we trigger the pipeline. Also, at the top of my file, if you notice, I have some squiggly lines at the top. If that bothers you, which in my case, it really does, you can add at the top the following code so Visual Studio Code recognizes the YAML language of this file. Here is my linting file, and when this command runs, it will check my bicep code against the bicep config.json file and make sure my code is up to the coding standards like I mentioned earlier. Now, before we discuss the deploy.yaml file, let's start setting up our environment in Azure DevOps. You will need to create a project in Azure DevOps. You will also need to sign into Azure and create 2 resource groups. In this case, I have a resource group called Toy Website Test and Toy Website Production. And then you need to create service connections in Azure DevOps so you can use it in your Azure pipelines. You will also need to create 2 environments in Azure DevOps. In my case, I have test and production. And you will also need 2 libraries in Azure DevOps for test and production. Now that we discussed the setup, let's switch back to our stages in the pipeline and let's take a look at the deploy.yaml file. First of all, I started defining a parameter for the environment type, and the first stage is the validation step. And I'm putting a condition saying if the environment is not equal to production, go ahead and run a validation step. In this step, I'm running AZ deployment group validate. And this parameter you see here in line 28, the values will be fed with the library we created earlier. Next in the list is I'm running AZ deployment group with the what if flag to have a preview of what will be created in production before proceeding with a full deployment. Same logic we saw earlier. This condition is saying if the environment is equal to production, then run the steps here. Next is the deploy stage, and if you notice, I don't have a condition for this one because we'll run this stage for both environments. And notice I'm calling the variable group which comes from the library we created earlier, and I'm using a parameter to say the variable group starts with toy website and then parameters environment type. In this case, it's called test, and the other one is production. Notice line 84 through line 105, and let's break this down. First, I am running set-e deployment output to grab the output values from the deployment when it finishes. The main command that will deploy my bicep file is the AC deployment group create, and I'm passing a few parameters that again will be passed from the library we created earlier. Now check out lines 94. You might be asking where these outputs come from. Well, these are the output values that come from the main.bicep file I showed you earlier. If I want to get the output and save it as a variable, all I have to do is call the variable like this. After the infrastructure has been deployed, we'll proceed to deploy the website code and also deploy the DAC file with the schema configurations into our newly created database. Many databases have schemas which represent the structure of the data contained in the database. It's often a good practice to apply a schema to your database from your deployment pipeline. This helps to ensure that everything your solution needs is deployed together. It also ensures that if there's a problem when the schema is applied, your pipeline will show you an error so that you can quickly fix the issue and redeploy. Okay, next, then I'm passing another condition saying if the environment is not equal to production, let's upload some test data, and I'm including a SQL file here. I'm also uploading an image to a storage account using a CLI task. Many solutions require reference data to be added to their databases or storage accounts before they work. And pipelines can be a good place to add this data. This means that after the pipeline runs, your environment is fully configured and ready to use. It's also helpful to have sample data in your databases, especially for non-production environments. This helps testers and other people who use those environments to be able to test your solution immediately. This data might include sample products as well as things like fake user accounts. Generally speaking, you don't want to add this data to your production environment. Finally, we have a smoke test to test all of our infrastructure to make sure everything that has been deployed is exactly what we were expecting. Notice I'm defining a variable and I'm calling one parameter, which is the app service app hostname, to run my test. In our case, in order to run the test, we are using Pester, and we have a Powershell script to run this test and then publish the test results in Azure DevOps. Let's take a quick look on the Powershell script. Basically, the test is very simple, just to make sure the website is served over HTTPS and non-HTTP, and running a health check on the website to make sure it's okay. Now let's go ahead and trigger this pipeline and wait to see the results. And with the magic of editing, this took around 10 to 15 minutes to run. So let's take a look at the resources in Azure. And here we have it, folks. To finish, let me show you the test results published in Azure DevOps. Here it is. All of this has been accomplished with a single pipeline deployment. This is how you manage an end-to-end deployment with Azure Bicep. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this video, and again, hit like and subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so you can be notified every time, and share it with others. Why not? I have to say it's fun to share when you learn something new. So all of you colleagues in technology, if you're starting in this amazing career, this is one of the most exciting careers because you always keep learning new things. So it's important to keep yourself motivated, and sometimes you might struggle trying to figure out how something works, but always keep it positive. It's just a matter of time when something makes click on your head, and then you feel amazing. But being persisting and keeping it positive is key to succeed in whatever you're trying to achieve in your career, not only in technology, but in everything else you do. So keep it up and see you in the next time.